Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. Okay, we're going to take a look at the Gospel of John. We must be mad. In less than 10 minutes, we're going to try and give some sense of the shape and structure of this Gospel. The fourth Gospel is deservedly got itself the reputation of being the most subtle and nuanced and complex. I sort of think of this as John warming up for the book of Revelation, where he's really going to turn the complexity up to 11 and rip the knob off. But in the meantime, John's Gospel has so much multi-layered complexity in it. There's no way we're going to capture all of the different themes and structures that are significant here. So what we're going to do is just make a couple of very, very basic and introductory comments, and then I'm going to highlight just a couple of structural themes which will help you get into it. This is by no means exhaustive, but by now you're realizing that we're not being really exhaustive with any of the biblical books we're looking at. So without further ado, John's Gospel, the message of John's Gospel can probably be summarized pretty well by what by what John records at the end of chapter 20. Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So it's a book full of signs, some of the signs Jesus did, and the signs are given so that we may believe in him. Now that's a clue to one of the most important structural themes of the book of John. The presence of 7 plus 1 miraculous signs in the first half of the book. The plus 1 is actually in the second half of the book. Come to that in a second. John's Gospel is customarily divided into two. The so-called Book of Signs in the first half, the first 12 chapters, and then sometimes the Book of Glory or the Book of Exaltation, doesn't matter what you call it, but the point is there's a distinct change from chapter 13 verse 1 to the end. Sometimes people suggest that chapter 1 is a prologue and chapter 21 is a kind of epilogue. If you like, that makes sense, but roughly speaking, there's a division into two, and the first book is called the Book of Signs because it has 7 signs in it. These are the signs which are mentioned in that kind of theme verse at the end of chapter 20, and it's worth just going through them one at a time. You'll be familiar with these, of course, but here we go. The first sign in chapter 1 is the changing water into wine at the wedding at Cana. And John says specifically, chapter 2, verse 11, this, the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So you see signs, his disciples believing in him. The second miraculous sign in chapter 4 is the healing of the royal official's son at Capernaum. And at the end of that, chapter 4, verse 54, this was now the second sign that Jesus did when he had come from Judea to Galilee. So what John is doing, he's telling you to count the signs. Like, you've had the first one, now you've had the second one. Come on, guys, this is all the clues you're going to be getting. So count the signs from now on. And so, just roughly speaking, you've got in chapter 5, the healing of the paralytic at Bethesda. You've got chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000. Then again in chapter 6, the fifth sign, Jesus walking on water. Chapter 9, you've got the healing of the man born blind. That's sign number 6. And then sign number 7 with the raising of Lazarus in John 11. Now, that gives you a kind of shape to the first book, the book of signs, the first half of the gospel. And one of the things to do as you're reading through is you've got to try and figure out how the material around those 7 signs fits with the signs themselves. Let me give you a couple of clues just to give you a sense of what I mean by that. In the first sign, you've got the water being turned into wine at a wedding. And then you've got immediately afterwards, you've got the cleansing of the temple, and you've got the conversation with Nicodemus, which comes straight after that. So something about the wine at the wedding is connected with renewing the temple, and in calling his people, Jesus' people, the people of Israel represented in Nicodemus, to a renewal and transformation of their relationship with him. The relationship between those signs is more complex and subtle than with some others. The clue, of course, is in the symbolism of wine from the Old Testament scriptures. Wine as the picture of the eschatological age when the Messiah will come, when the Lord will dwell among his people, when the temple will be renewed, when his people will be raised to new life, Ezekiel 37, and so on and so forth. Those things are in the background of the surrounding context, and they make sense of the imagery in the sign. So what you see what we've got to do. You've got to think, okay, here's the sign, how does it fit with the surrounding material? Let's take a slightly more straightforward example. Jesus and the woman a woman of Samaria in chapter 4 immediately precedes the second sign, which is a healing of an official's son, again, in a Gentile-dominated, or at least not pure Israelite region up in the north in Galilee. There's clearly a connection there. Jesus is extending the arm of his mercy beyond just the people of Israel to the northerners, the people outside the pure southern Judean stock, at least that's how they liked to think of themselves. In the healing of the pool at Bethesda in chapter 5, well, that takes place on the Sabbath and immediately precipitates a conversation, well, a confrontation really, with the Jewish authorities about Jesus' authority, and particularly his authority to work on the Sabbath. And Jesus then spins that off into a conversation about his connection with the Father, and the Father's working even till now, and so I'm working as well, and so on. Another one where the connection is somewhat easier to see. In chapter 6, you got the feeding of the 5,000 and walking on water, which look like they're kind of connected signs in some sense, perhaps because of the background of the wilderness wanderings, bread from heaven, and then going through the waters, the Red Sea and the Jordan. And then immediately the discourse that follows is the famous chapter 6 bread of life discourse, when Jesus identifies himself as the true bread that's come down from heaven, in contrast with the manna in the wilderness which Moses gave the people from God. So you can see what we're doing here. As you're working through, you've got the signs, which I've shown you. You've got the surrounding material, and the challenge is, can you work out how it fits together? And if you can do that, what you'll be doing is you'll first be tracing the theme of the gospel itself, or themes of the gospel itself. Second, you'll start to be able to see which Old Testament imagery is being brought to bear upon the signs in particular, because there's a huge amount of Old Testament background to John's Gospel. Don't be fooled by the fact that, unlike Matthew, he doesn't quote the Old Testament. Old Testament scriptural themes are all over the Gospel of John. And then, of course, also, you'll start to understand the discourses a little bit more. We shouldn't, for example, try and read John chapter 6, the bread of life discourse, without recognizing the background in the signs that immediately precede it. And notice also, sometimes the signs come before, sometimes after the discourse that's connected to them. It's a little bit more complex, like I said earlier, than, let's say, in Matthew's Gospel, where the pattern is sort of signs or miracles, teaching, miracles, teaching, miracles, teaching. It's a little bit more straightforward, at least superficially there. Okay, so that's some thoughts on the signs. If you trace through the occurrence of the word sign in the Gospel as well, you discover some kind of interesting things. What happens, or one of the things that happens, is that you see the development of people's faith and trust in Christ as they see the signs that he gives them. So, for example, chapter 2, verse 23, many people believe because of the signs that Jesus had been doing. Signs plural, even though he's only done one up to that point, because remember, there's lots of others that he's doing, according to the end of the gospel, that aren't recorded here. Chapter 3, verse 2, even Nicodemus says, look, we know you're the teacher come from heaven because of all the signs you're doing. Nobody could do these signs unless he were from God. And people saw the signs Jesus was doing, chapter 6, verse 2. Chapter 12, verse 18, the crowd went to him because of the signs that he'd been doing. But the response is not uniformly positive. And also, if you look through the gospel, what you find is that there is a certain group or subgroup of Jewish leaders who either don't believe the signs, or they can see that the signs are miraculous, and they nonetheless resent the fact that Jesus is doing them precisely because they're being so persuasive. So they demand a sign sometimes, or they complain to each other, what are we going to do about this guy because of all the signs he's performing? Or some of them believe because of the signs and some of them don't. So I'll leave you to find all those references. Just Google signs in John's Gospel, or look in a concordance and you'll find that. Just one final thought. That's all been really about the first half of John's Gospel, up to chapter 12, which ends climactically as Jesus hides himself from them at the end of the seventh sign, the raising of Lazarus. And then you've got this Jesus crying out, whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. And then that very short set of sayings really concludes the book of signs at the end of chapter 12. Then you're into the book of glory. Goodness gracious. This is, I find this one of the most difficult parts of Scripture to get to grips with. Particularly chapters 13 through 17. Long series of long discourses. It's really hard, I find, to follow the logic of what Jesus is saying. It seems superficially clear sometimes, but then it's chapter 15, at least, I can get my head around that, but it's really hard in chapters 16 and 17 and bits of chapter 14 as well to figure out what Jesus is saying. So what I encourage you to do is just got to wrestle with that. Try and track the argument that Jesus is developing. And then, of course, at the end, you've got the familiar set of events, crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. Not ascension, sorry, crucifixion and resurrection and post-resurrection appearances, but told, of course, from a distinctly Johannine perspective. And instead of a great commission in so many words, you've got a miraculous catch of fish, which, of course, has all that great commission resonance to it, because the disciples of Jesus are fishermen going out to the nations to draw people to worship the living God. Okay, best I can do. Goodness gracious, 11 minutes. I hope that's helpful, getting you a little bit into this truly magnificent climax to the four Gospels, the Gospel of John. And maybe if you've got any questions, then feel free to ping them my way and we'll pick them up in future devotions. But for now, that'll do us. I think the Lord bless you, and I hope very much to see you soon. Bye for now.